Hi folks, Bill McManus back with The Making of a Millionaire. Well, I just had another call with Greg, and I just wanted to share the information with you. Again, another great call. He truly inspires me, and I'm learning as I go. And I want you folks to learn as you go and follow along on this journey with me. I got some notes to my left here, so I'm going to be looking at those. If you don't mind me looking off to the left every once in a while. First of all, I happened to catch him on Facebook, and it was very late his time. And he was working on a book that he's been working on called The Gift. And The Gift basically is about living your perfect life. He's working on it with some other people. And he asked me if I'd be interested in going through an exercise from this book, The Gift. And I said, yeah. So we hooked up about 10 or 15 minutes later after he prepared. And the first thing he asked me in this exercise was to describe myself. If somebody didn't know Bill McManus, how would you describe Bill McManus? Just quickly. And I said, well, okay, I'm a husband and a father, first and foremost. I'm a struggling entrepreneur. I feel like I'm trapped in my job. I have some internal burdens. I have some things in my life that make me unhappy. And, I went through a lot of things just right off the cuff. And he says, okay, and then we stopped. And he reread the list back to me. He highlighted some of the items that I had listed. And then he told me, he said, the language you use inside yourself, to describe yourself, is what's echoed back to you from other people in your life. And he says, essentially, the label that we put on the experiences of our life is what becomes the experiences. So essentially, if you say you don't have enough time, you don't have enough money, you don't have enough success, you never will. He says you just keep attracting that negativism towards you. And a lot of you folks are probably familiar with The Secret and the law of attraction. And I believe that. I believe if you focus on the negative, that's what you're going to get back in your life. And if you focus on the positive, that's going to come back to you. And typically I focus on the positive, but I guess deep down inside when he asked me those questions and the things that I put forth were pretty much, if you look at them, they're negative. I use the word struggling entrepreneur. I use the word trapped. I have internal burdens. So essentially I'm not following that positive law of attraction that I should be. He says, basically, if I define myself as struggling and burning and unsuccessful, I never will be. He says, I have to describe myself. I have to change and describe myself as being successful. If I describe myself as successful, eventually I will become successful. If I say I'm unsuccessful, I never will be. So, and then he says, okay, now, the language that you currently use, what's the benefit of using that kind of negative language? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe it's a kind of a built-in excuse for not achieving what I have at this point. And he says, yeah, in a way. And he says, but also it's socially acceptable languages. If you look out there, a lot of people use negatives in their life, and they use excuses and stuff like that. He says, and also, if you went out and you told people like, yeah, I'm going to go out and I'm going to take all these challenges on, I'm going to make a massive difference in my life and that of my family, and people would just say, yeah, right, Bill. And he says, And he says, and basically, and I'm sorry, he says, you're just going to become their bitch. And I know maybe he's right. Maybe when you listen to the people's doubts and you let them rain down on you and rob you of your dreams, you are becoming their bitch. He says, well, why don't you make them your bitch? He says, and he said it this way, he says, destiny is beckoning you forward. He says, you're living an unfulfilled life. He said, it's not even a fraction of the life that you want to live. And that's why you have this internal struggle that you want. And here's one thing he said, and this was really key, and this really caught me. He said, hell on earth would be meeting the man you could have become. He says, think about that. He goes, think of the turmoil and how hectic it would be to meet the man that you could have been, that you didn't become because of your fears and not taking action. And that really struck out. That was a really powerful exercise, thinking about that. And I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit more. He says what we need to do is we need to redefine who I am. He says we need you to get to the real you. He says he and my wife and my kids and my family and friends, they need me to be the real Bill McManus, because that's when I'm going to find happiness in this world. And he says when you do that, he says you're going to help them because you're going to show them that it's okay for them to do it too. So he says, do it. What the hell's keeping you from doing it? And I guess he's right. He says, I reached out to him because I'm trying to get to the real me. And he says, what we do is we got to define what we need to do to get you back to the real man that you really are inside. Right now, I feel, why do I feel trapped? Why do I feel burdened? Yeah, I feel like I'm a puppet. I'm a corporate puppet. I'm not doing what I want. That's why I'm not happy. He says the first thing we have to do is we have to change my language massively. The language that I use to describe myself and describe my life has to be turned right around. I got to start using positive words versus negative words. Instead of saying I'm a struggling entrepreneur, I got to say I'm an incredibly successful entrepreneur. I'm a very talented and successful Forex trader. I have no burdens. I'm happy. Things of that nature. So that's one thing I'm going to do. I'm going to identify the language that I use for myself, and I'm going to turn it around. I'm going to make it positive, and I'm going to focus on that from now on. And then he says, I have to define who I am in the future. And this kind of goes back to the earlier call, earlier video when I talked about goals. So I really, I've defined my goals, and I think I really know who I want to be in the future. But I think I have to look at it as that's who I'm going to be in the future. Not just that they're goals, but I have to start seeing myself that way. And the third thing he says, when you start using self-minimizing languages, you've got to use some kind of pattern interrupt to stop that. And he told me about a friend of his who's very successful, but he tended to use minimizing languages. So they came up with a word, he calls him schmiegel. Whenever he starts using that minimizing language, he said the man's very successful, has like multiple businesses, very successful, but he still talks negative and says, he's moderately successful. And he always says, okay, Schmiegel, there's Schmiegel talking again. So I need to start being aware, and I want you folks to be aware of when you start using minimizing languages to describe yourself or describe your life or your business. And again, we need to stop it, turn around and make it positive, because if we're positive, we're going to attract positive things in our life. And it's all about happiness. He says a true entrepreneur who is someone connects with who they really are and does more of who they are. And when you do that, you're happy. And then he says, then the money will come in abundance. So he says, define what you want to do and start doing it now. If you had all the money in the world, what would you do? And he asked me that. And I'm going to ask you to think about that. If you had all the money and time in the world, just like your perfect day, what would you do? I said, okay, well, the first thing I would do is I would speak about my entrepreneurial experiences. And number two, I would trade the Forex, which is one thing I've always wanted to do. If I had the time, I want to write children's books. And four, I would like to work with fellow entrepreneurs and children. And he says, you could do whatever you want. He says, you just need a little oomph behind you and faith in order to do it. And he said, one of the biggest things people are afraid to do is get out of their comfort zones. He says, you need to get uncomfortable to get successful. He says, comfort is a killer. It kills us every time. He says, you don't want to be comfortable. And maybe I'm a little too comfortable, but with this project, I'm going to get uncomfortable. So he says, again, why don't you start sharing your experiences now? And I said, well, that's what I'm doing. I got this YouTube channel that I've started. I've started a blog. You can look below. There's a link to my blog. I've also set up Making of a Millionaire website, www.makingofamillionaire.com. I'm sharing information. There'll be videos, ties to the blog. Everything's kind of tied into there. So I'm starting to share my story, at least through the social media, Facebook and things of that nature. And I hope to very soon start speaking, even if it's just to small groups, about this project. And as it grows, I hope that things grow and I start speaking in front of thousands of people like Greg does someday. So basically, it's about faith and doing what you want. And one thing he says, the universe is like a pizza delivery company. He says, whatever you order, it comes. Whether it's 2 pizzas or 10,000 pizzas, the universe will deliver. He says the only time that it won't is if you don't believe that delivery man's coming. And again, this is all faith and that whole thing about positive and law of attraction, being positive and having faith. So that's about it for now. One thing I want to challenge you to do is which is what I'm working on right now, is meeting the man I could have been exercise. What I started to do was I actually kind of like the perfect day. I sat down and I started to visualize what it would be like if I didn't make any changes in my life, and I ran into and met the man that I could have been, the man that I'm going to be. But think about that. So your exercise, first of all, is how do you define yourself now? Just straight out flat, be honest with yourself. If you're going to describe yourself to somebody, how would you describe yourself? And identify those negative items and languages and things you use to describe yourself. And we want to identify how, and we want to turn around and make them positive. And from now on, you want to use positive phrases. Think about having some kind of pattern interrupt. Pay attention to the way you're using positive and negative verbiage during your day. When you start using negative verbiage, cut yourself off and start being positive. When you address yourself and introduce yourself to somebody, carry yourself like you're already successful. And the next thing I want you to do is think about that exercise, meeting the person you could have been, meeting that successful person you could have been if you did follow through and did what you want. Now, what would that be like? And I want you to write it out. Vision yourself right now
meeting the person you could have been, and how would it really feel? What is that person like? What do they look like? What do they feel like? How do they carry themselves? What do they have? And how does that make you feel if you didn't achieve that? Meeting the person you could have been. Think about that. That's really powerful. Greg says it's very powerful. Okay, that's about it for now. I'm gearing up for my trip to London to start my Forex trading. I'm very, very excited.